Hi, welcome to this webinar run by Aussie Deaf Kids about children with hearing loss and the NDIS. My name is Megan Barr. I'm a speech pathologist and special education teacher. I've worked for more than 20 years with children with hearing loss, and in most recent years, I've navigated the NDIS system here in Newcastle, where it was run as a trial. Over the years, I've worked for the Cochlear Implant Centre, RIDBC, which is now known as Next Sense, and in local schools as an NDIS provider. I am a lecturer and a researcher at the University of Newcastle and have just completed my PhD on the NDIS. So I could talk for a very long time, but I've just chosen a few key topics to talk to you about today. So I'll share that presentation with you now. I want to share with you a bit. Firstly, some of my research that I have been doing with my supervisors, Dr. Jill Duncan, who's on the board of Aussie Deaf Kids, and Kerry Daly, another researcher and lecturer at the University of Newcastle. I then want to apply some of what's happening recently in the NDIS and what is happening in schools and how that works for you. So first we'll look at parent experiences from all around Australia, what's going on in the NDIS at the moment, how school and the NDIS can work together, and ideas for using the NDIS funding in the best possible way. So for parent experiences of the NDIS, I did a survey of parents all around Australia. They came from all different states and territories and had 57 parents who responded who had experience of the NDIS. This was a couple of years back, so I had responses from more parents than this, and some of them hadn't had the NDIS at that time. I then interviewed 7 parents from different regional and rural areas around the country and what their experience of the NDIS was. And I just want to share what's going on for some other parents. There was a range of hearing loss, but the majority had a severe or profound hearing loss. 34 of the children used spoken language only, 1 used sign language only, and 22 used a combination of both sign and spoken language. 22 children had additional disability to the hearing loss. Basically, at that point in time, there was a real spread of satisfaction with planning and with planning meetings. Some parents were very happy with that process and some were very unhappy. However, the majority found the process of starting on the NDIS very difficult. And at that time, the majority found the NDIA difficult to contact. Since then, the NDIA has created targets for answering phone calls in a certain time frame and for having more consistent points of contact. So I'm hoping that contacting the NDIA is an improved experience for you now. This is how much the average NDIS packages were for children with hearing loss. And you can see the majority were in that $10,000 to $15,000 range, with some up or down from that, but very few $20,000 or more per year. And it's interesting, there was a real spread of satisfaction with the funding. So equal amounts strongly disagree and agree, and pretty much equal amounts agree and strongly agree. Disagree and strongly agree. So it was a real spread. Parent experiences seem to be equally satisfied and dissatisfied. And I think one of the things to consider with these findings is the inconsistency of the NDIS. And some of that is weighing out here, that some people are very happy and some are not happy. However, when I looked at all the comments through all of the surveys and interviewed parents, there were very few comments talking about the ease of the NDIS or the satisfaction. Part of that is human nature. Part of it is that it's a new system and it's difficult to navigate. So I've pulled out some comments that are typical threads coming through all the parents that I've interviewed, surveyed and talked to. I'll let you read these comments. So comments about planners. Comments about consistency and about fairness. Very common to have comments about the advocacy that parents and professionals need to take on to get a fair NDIS package for children with hearing loss. And comments about the anxiety and the unknown. What's going to happen next? So they're all, those themes are what came through talking to parents. And because the NDIS is changing constantly, there is that anxiety about what change is going to happen next. Will the funding be consistent and will it be fair? I just want to talk about some recent changes to the NDIS. Obviously, the hot topic at the moment is independent assessments, and I will include that in this section too. So you will be aware that the NDIS has three main pathways for entry. The ECEI, the Early Childhood Early Intervention pathway for children 6 years and under. The main pathway for people aged 7 to 65 years. And then the complex support needs pathway. So that's for people with disability that has very complex needs or complex interactions with other systems like health or justice or housing. Now, in the area of children with hearing loss, we're really fortunate to have some fantastic advocates, and thanks to Aussie Deaf Kids for being advocates on your behalf in this, lobbying the government to say children who are coming in through the early childhood, early intervention stream with hearing loss were having gaps in service. They were not having that early service that they needed from as soon as they got their hearing aids. So the only disability group in the ECEI pathway to have their specific stream of access is children with hearing loss. And all reports from the professionals I surveyed and interviewed have said that children are getting much quicker and better access now that there's that hearing stream. So it's great to know there are people advocating strongly on behalf of children with hearing loss to the government. In the main pathway, there's a specific stream for people with mental health needs, and they're the only two specific streams within the NDIS at this stage. Just to let you know, the NDIS is creating an app. Given some of the teething problems there may be with the app, you may want to wait to uptake that app for some time, or you may want to be part of the trial and be part of ironing out any issues, but they say that is coming soon. Now, what is in the news a lot at the moment is independent assessments. Some of the information that's coming out about independent assessments is not actually based on legislation and information from the NDIA. I would encourage you all just to check every now and then. There's a link on the NDIS website for media and news, and those are the items that are worth looking at, because sometimes in the news articles they say, you know, news this week has reported that independent assessments are rolling out next week. This is untrue. Like, it really does keep you up to date with what is actually happening from the NDIA. So if you're ever not sure, I would click through some of those media releases and the latest minister statements. So why are they looking at independent assessments? In a review, the Tune review of the NDIA, of the NDIS, it was recommended to have independent assessments. However, in practice, a lot of lobby groups and a lot of disability groups are concerned about the concept and the practicalities of independent assessments. And this is why. So the NDIA is saying that independent assessments will make access simpler. So in one way, that is very true. You go to the NDIA and they organise the assessment. So there's only one port of call. So that does simplify the process. You don't need to organise your own assessments. They say it's faster because you go straight to the NDIA and they allocate up to 3 hours for an assessment. I am not convinced that's any faster than organising your own assessment, but that's their claim. They're also claiming that it's fairer, and I do think independent assessments are fairer. For families who can't afford to pay for detailed assessments from a range of professionals to access the NDIS, having independent assessments is definitely a fairer system. And they're saying it's fairer because they can do telehealth, telepractice assessments for people in rural and remote areas using qualified professionals. In that way, it is fairer. They're also saying it's more flexible for participants because they'll organise the assessment when they want it. Well, I don't think that's a valid argument. I think you can organise an assessment when you want it if you have an assessment with a known professional as well. Future and current participants will no longer need to organise the assessment, saving them time and money. It may save time. I'm not sure that interactions with the NDIA are a time saver from experience. Sometimes you actually save time using the professional that you're seeing week to week, but that's their argument. A money saver, definitely. They're paying for the assessment, so it definitely saves money. And that's money you will not have to spend out of your plan to have an assessment. Independent assessments use internationally recognised tools and will be used by qualified health professionals, which is true. And they will be available no matter where a person lives and no matter what their circumstances are. That's great. And that is some of the fairness of an independent assessment. There are some disadvantages of an independent assessment too. It won't be completed by a known professional. So you will have to go over all that background case history again. And also it's someone who may not be appropriate to the disability. So you may have a physiotherapist assessing your child with hearing loss, and that may not be the best match. So there are definite benefits of having an assessment from a known professional who has a relationship with your family and with your child. They are generic assessments. There's only about 3 assessments that are applied to all children under 6 and 3 assessments that are applied for all people from 7 to 65. So there's only so much they can capture. So having to use those assessments is not individualised. The NDIS is meant to be individualised and does not support choice and control, which is another argument. But I think particularly in the area of hearing loss, the main disadvantage is that the trigger for NDIS funding is disability, is falling below a certain standard and not supporting children to reach a certain standard. So it's a very disability focused. Just as an example of this, I read about this girl in the newspaper and I recognised her because I worked with her as a baby, and it's freely available on the internet, so I know that it is okay to share from her story. So I worked with Isabel when she was just a baby at the Cochlear Implant Centre, and she had intensive regular support. Her mother and her whole family were very supportive and worked so hard with Isabel. And now Isabel's all grown up and this is what she's achieving. Now, Isabel had that support throughout her childhood because she had a profound hearing loss. If she was assessed on the functional assessment suggested by the NDIA, she may perform above average. So her funding may stop because she wasn't clicking under a certain criteria and hitting a disability criteria. However, her potential is obviously above average, and we want children to reach their potential. So functional assessments don't capture that you want a child to reach their potential. They just capture you don't want children below average, even if their potential is well above average. There has been talk in the media that you cannot review an independent assessment. You cannot say, this is not right, I want this decision reviewed. I've read articles that say that, but I've got on the NDIA website and I've double, triple checked. Yes, you can request a review internally through the NDIA. So you can appeal that decision from the independent assessment if you think it is not correct. Then there's another layer of appeal. If you're not happy with the decision made by the NDIA, you can go to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, an independent organisation that assesses government decisions. They assess, is this a lawful decision or not? The funding amount you've been given, and they may change the legislation based on the outcome of cases. And there's a website there and you can see what kind of cases are up for appeal at the moment. As is with the NDIS, it's always changing. So on the 12th of April, just to let you know if you weren't updated, from April to June 30, if your plan is due to end, you may be eligible to extend the plan without a review for up to 12 months. So if your plan review meeting is meant to be booked between April and June, you can have an automatic extension. Interesting that they say, we will get in touch to see if you would like it. Then the next point, you can also contact us. So I will be on the front foot generally contacting them and requesting an automatic plan extension. And the criteria is that your plan is 12 months or longer, but you can't be through the ECEI. The NDIS have to be 7 years or older. And just the other day, the 23rd of April, there was another media update, and the NDIA have released new guidelines to make the NDIS simpler and clearer. So they've rewritten things and clarified some issues. One of the more interesting web pages that you can visit is Would We Fund It? So I just looked at Would We Fund It under their early childhood, early intervention supports. And basically they go through sensory equipment for children. They're just examples. So sensory equipment, would they fund it? And basically they've written, there's no evidence to say it's reasonable and necessary. No. iPads, would they fund it? Unless they're critical to a disability support, like a communication for a non-verbal child, no. Swimming lessons, it's reasonable and necessary that all parents pay for their own children's swimming lessons, so generally no. Nappies, basically the answer is no to most of these, except in extreme circumstances. But they do talk through the reasoning for it and the exceptions. Okay, moving on to how the NDIS and schools can work together. For all children starting school, I absolutely make sure they have had a recent IQ assessment. I think that a lot of teachers have the expectation that a child with a hearing loss will be performing below average. And what is critical for children with hearing loss before they start school is to have an IQ assessment to see where their IQ is actually lying. Are they average? Well, then their academic results should be average. Are they low IQ? If they're low IQ and their academic results are low, they are performing at their potential, and that is a good outcome. If they are high IQ and well above the mean, the school expectation should be that their academic results are high and they're performing at their potential. And we need to communicate this clearly to the school, that the expectation of what we want for education for children with hearing loss is for them to reach their potential. If their potential is average, they should not be below average. If their potential is high, their academic results should not be average. Each individual state has a web page about the interaction of that Department of Education with the NDIS. And I think Anne was talking about creating links for this on Aussie Deaf Kids. Now, I've just got Victoria's page up here as an example and what they have put on their webpage. So what they have said is it's the parent's job to plan therapy times with the NDIS therapist. Yes, it is the parent job, but the school has to be involved in that. The child has to be in school for a certain amount of curriculum hours, and we would not want to take a child with hearing loss out of literacy time. So we want to make sure it's a time that is beneficial for the child and suits the school and the therapist. So you need a team approach to planning a time. You definitely need to agree to what's happening in therapy, but it's good to communicate this with the school as well. You need to tell the therapist if your child's sick, because you don't want the therapist turning up to the school and your child is not there. That's reasonable. But here it says the parent is responsible for telling the school how therapy is going. The parent is responsible to tell the school if a child stops therapy, which is fair. And you can get school therapy services in Victoria as well as NDIS paid therapy. And I just say here that for a parent to tell the school how therapy is going is not good practice. The teacher should be involved in that too. There should be team-based communication about how therapy is going at school. There are some exceptions of how this works. Queensland has school-based therapists, so they already have that good relationship within the school, and every state is a bit different. But it should be a team-based, no matter how it's funded or where the therapists come from, or the itinerant teachers of the deaf. There should be strong links between the itinerant teacher of the deaf, the classroom teacher, any therapists, and they should communicate clearly between them. It shouldn't be solely the responsibility of the parent to communicate that to the teacher. If you don't have a teacher of the deaf or therapist who is communicating clearly both to you and the mainstream teacher, I would argue that they're not fulfilling their role. The NDIS actually wants a transdisciplinary approach. So this is a term to know, and you can argue in your plan, that one professional, and transdisciplinary just means you have a key worker. So one professional is the lead provider. So there's a full team involved in managing your child's hearing loss, and that will be your audiologist, mainstream teacher, or teacher in the classroom if you're at a special school, itinerant teacher of the deaf, speech pathologist. Now, one of those team members should be the principal one for coordinating that approach. And NDIS really supports this transdisciplinary approach. So you can use your NDIS funded teacher or therapist to be the key worker. And it should be them. It shouldn't be a support coordinator, because you need someone who knows the goals, who is in touch with what's happening with the child, and can communicate that to all other professionals. These days, it's not that hard. There are some fantastic apps. You may already use Seesaw or Classly or one of those apps. I find Seesaw fantastic for communicating with other professionals. The NDIS also says that it will not overlap with school. So NDIS is life skill funding. Education should fund everything academic. So if you mention any school-based issue to the NDIA planner, they will just say no. That's basically their take on anything to do with education funding. I know I even interviewed some parents who were having tele-school support through the Royal Institute for Deaf and Blind Children, and the Royal Institute for Deaf and Blind Children have changed the name of that support now, because parents are saying, I want tele-school, which is intervention over video conferencing, and the NDIA planner would just say, nope, we're not funding anything to do with school. And they're like, it's not school. It has the word school in it. The NDIA planner was saying no. And what we do know is NDIA planners may not have any background in disability. Some of them seem to be occupational therapists or social workers, but many of them have a background from Centrelink or even the Air Force. So not all of them have a knowledge of disability. So we need to present our argument and present our case for what our goals will be for a child in NDIA language, because they don't actually understand the full impacts of disability. They understand the terms on the forms and the pro formas that they're using. And these are the areas that they're told they are looking at to fund: communication, social interaction, learning, mobility, self-care and self-management. But if you think about that in terms of children with hearing loss, there are so many of those areas that are very valid goals, and valid goals throughout a child's development. What we know from the research is, regardless of how much improvement there has been in signed and spoken communication in recent years for children with hearing loss, there's still a bit of a gap in literacy skills. So we always want to target literacy. Every time I see a child with hearing loss, I'm working on literacy. And literacy is a part of these things. Literacy is a part of written communication. Literacy is definitely a part of learning. Literacy is a part of self-care and self-management. If you can't read a recipe, if you can't read a medicine pack, if you can't read a program when you're going to a musical, and if you can't read the driving test instructions, that has a real impact on your self-care and self-management. So framing literacy goals in terms of those life goals is really important for children with a hearing loss. The same with social skills. Social skills are lifelong learning. I know we all go home from something, go, oh, I shouldn't have said that. I should have held my tongue then. Oh, why did they say that? Do you think they think this? Social skills is really a lifelong learning. And we want our kids with hearing loss to have good social skills and to always be working on their social skills. So we can request that in their NDIS funding. It is a part of communication. It is a part of social interaction. It is also a part of learning. So we want to include those literacy and social skills should be targeted for children with hearing loss for life, definitely up to the time they leave school. Now, if we have those literacy skills, I'm not going to work on literacy skills in isolation from a classroom teacher. So it makes sense to be communicating with the classroom teacher what their literacy skills are, and everybody be on the same page when working on those goals. Yes, one is funded by education and the other is funded by the NDIS. Education is looking at academic goals. NDIS is looking at these life goals. So some tips for school: definitely monitor what class time your child is missing. If you find that they're doing a craft activity that you could catch up with at home and they could actually have therapy in that time, that may be a good time to miss. If you find that they're doing a library lesson and you can read that book at home, that might be a good one to miss. Social support in the playground is definitely a valid use of NDIS funding, and because much of a child's life at school, if you have that social interaction support, imagine having a teacher in the playground with your child, even if it's only once a term, to find out what's going on and what the social interaction is like. As a parent, that's really valuable. As a parent with a child with hearing loss, it's totally a very important information gathering exercise, and looking at how you can support their social skills, because often a lot of learning at school is in the playground, and sometimes social skills get bumped to below the academic achievements in terms of your goals for a child. But I would argue that having good social skills and being able to make friends and interact with people should be a really high priority goal. One thing you can do in school, and I've had some questions pop up, is consider collaborating with other parents to have a therapist of your choice. So if you hear there's a really good therapist at a school, even if hearing loss might not be their specialty, but you've heard they're a good therapist, you might want to have that therapist and work out with other parents using your funding to have that therapist at the school consistently so they can build that relationship with the staff and get to know the curriculum well for that school. Also, someone was saying that their school, for specific purposes, the principal has banned therapists coming in because there were just too many requests. It is totally up to the principal whether they allow, at least in New South Wales, allow therapists into the school or not. And I understand that some schools are having more than 50 different therapists. Now, parents should have choice and control, but then the principal should allow what's reasonable and necessary. You can imagine having that many therapists coming in and out of a school is just so disruptive. If you have a principal who is reticent to allow therapists in school, and there's a number of parents that really want therapy in school to support their children, I would recommend that you join together with other parents and choose one therapist or maybe two therapists for that school that you would recommend, because it's reasonable or necessary for the principal to say, right, we're endorsing these two occupational therapists and these two speech pathologists. And if you want to use someone outside of that, that's your choice and control, but it must be outside school hours. It is better practice because then those therapists can really build up that relationship with the school and get a deeper knowledge of what's going on, a knowledge and communication with the staff and the curriculum in that environment. So, how to use NDIS funding to support best outcomes for children with hearing loss. Just want to share here what I found from the professional surveys and interviews that I also did. I surveyed 100 professionals for all around Australia, and you'll see here that they have a lot of experience for children with hearing loss. Most of them have been working in the area for more than 10 years. When I asked them, do mainstream teachers understand how to cater for children with hearing loss? Most of them didn't think they did. When I asked the parents the same question, they were much more understanding and said, oh, I think they're pretty good. Whereas teachers at the desk said they do not know enough, unequivocally. So I just want to talk about how you may be able to use your NDIS funding to address this issue. You may notice that the words are used very specifically as an NDIS price guide. The reason they say guide is because they want to encourage some flexibility in NDIS funding. So it is a guide, but it is flexible. I will just put it out there at the beginning. It's probably not the most popular viewpoint, but I've seen it time and time again, that if you're having individual therapy at school and there's no communication with you as a parent or no communication with a teacher, and it's just happening as an independent, isolated event, it is a total waste of NDIS funding and a waste of time. Children need support to be integrated and meaning throughout the day, throughout the curriculum and at home, to generalise and learn skills. Having one-on-one therapy just in isolation with a non-communicative teacher or therapist is not a good use of NDIS funding. A good use of NDIS funding is to pay the key worker for regular meetings with the classroom teacher. So you want someone to be regularly meeting with the classroom teacher and sharing goals. And this should be at least once a term. I would encourage, regardless of the level of your child's hearing loss, that the key worker is meeting with the mainstream teacher once a term and they're sharing and collaborating goals. The goal sharing should be mutual. So very often I've heard teachers say, oh, this itinerant teacher or this therapist came in and asked me for my goals. I'm like, oh, okay. So did you send them? Yeah, I sent them. I said, did the therapist or the itinerant teacher give you theirs? No. It should be both ways. It should be mutual goal sharing. As time has gone on, I've seen again and again the benefits of pre-teaching. So when teachers and key workers meet at these meetings, so I've worked in a school and I've met with the classroom teacher, said, okay, what are you doing in HISI this term? And they say Australian animals. I go, great. I'm working on building vocabulary and sentence structure. I'll make sure those goals are centred around Australian animals. So before they are learning those words in classroom, I've already been teaching them and talked to the parents at home about the text that they're reading in class. So at home, the parents are reading the texts and the books that they're going to do that term in class, and the child is learning new vocabulary and sentence structures. So everyone's working around the same sort of goals. The benefits I've seen from pre-teaching rather than revision is that when a topic is brought up in the classroom, often a child with a hearing loss is quiet and doesn't initiate and doesn't have the self-confidence to answer in a group setting. When I've seen children who have been pre-taught vocabulary, it's fantastic to see their hand in the air, they're confident, they're initiating, and they're wanting to contribute to those classroom discussions, and it really improves their social skills as well. So if there's anything I would highly recommend, it's pre-teaching your children at school. The other thing is you can use NDIS funding for training all the school staff every year. Your itinerant teacher of the deaf may do that through education funding, but if they're not, I would think it's good use of money, even if it's for only 20 minutes on their compulsory learning days that teachers have, to revise what are good listening conditions for a child with a hearing loss. And children with hearing loss should have equal access to hearing in all subjects. So you want the sport teacher to be able to use an FM. You want them to use the FM in assemblies. You want the librarian to be confident using the FM. So the child with hearing loss is getting good access to hearing regardless of the teacher. So that's why it needs to be all the school staff. You need to pay a key worker to have time to communicate between the school and you and any other workers in that team. And I would argue it's a really good use of money. If everyone's on the same page and working towards the same goals, that is much better use of funding. And you may have 2 less one-on-one therapy sessions because you're paying for 15 minutes more communication each week to get everyone on the same page, but it's a much better model, much better for generalisation of learning new skills and for meaningful learning for the child. I could go on, but I will stop here. These are my contact details. If you have any questions, do feel free to email me. And I would just address 1 or 2 questions that have been in the chat. So I'll stop this share. And I'm going to read a few of the questions that have been in the share. So one of the questions is, how does the teacher convey to you that your child is in the right bracket, is performing in the right bracket? So a teacher should be regularly assessing a child, and teachers have really good knowledge of where children are performing in their peer group, and they have regular checkpoints. So touching base with the teacher every term, you can talk to them about how your child is performing in literacy, how they're performing in maths, and they will know if they're average. So are they performing at a class level, or if they're below average, or if they're above average. Teachers are continually checking against the curriculum and have all the children in their class. They have a really good understanding of where their ability is. So you can just touch base with the teacher about that, and the key worker should definitely be doing that at least once a term. Another question is, how do we know IQ assessments are not affected by the hearing loss? And that's a really good question. So I've always worked with children with hearing loss or communication difficulties, and IQ assessments are separated into two areas, verbal IQ and non-verbal IQ. So psychologists have a good look at a child with hearing loss's non-verbal IQ, but they also have a look at verbal IQ. If you are able to get a psychologist through a specialist organisation like Hear and Say or Telethon or Next Sense, those psychologists will be very familiar with assessing children with hearing loss and are used to giving a diagnosis knowing the hearing loss is a factor. So if you can, pay for an NDIS assessment through a psychologist through one of those services. If not, if you can't access that or you don't have enough NDIS funding for that, all schools have a school counsellor. You should request an assessment through the school counsellor. And they are also trained in giving assessments for children with disability, but the better assessment will probably come from a specialist organisation. So I'd recommend that be your first point of call. Another question I've had is that a parent is saying they have not heard about this transdisciplinary approach. It is up to me to share information between therapists. How do I find a therapist who will take on this key worker role? I would ask the therapist too. Most therapists are happy to do it. You need to pay them for their time. If your therapist is not happy to be the communicator and take on that role and really communicate to you about what they're doing in that role, I would find a new therapist. So looking at some NDIS funded worker who is happy to take on that role. Another comment is, I'm doing the most of the legwork connecting my child with therapy and school, etc. This is hard when I have no idea about the NDIS. It's new to me, challenging, juggling other kids, and constantly advocate for my child, especially in the school setting. So again, I would definitely recommend finding someone, a therapist, a teacher of the deaf who's funded, that you can fund to be that key worker role and take some of that pressure off you, because parenting's hard enough, let alone having to advocate for your child and communicate between therapists and doing all of that. Use some of your NDIS funding for that and request it in your plans. The NDIA planner should know that transdisciplinary approach is fundamental to the NDIA. So if you ask for a transdisciplinary, you want a key worker and you want that funded in your plan, and this is how many hours you want them to do, like you would want someone to communicate every week. So it's reasonable to have at least 15, 20 minutes every week time for a therapist to be communicating between everyone, or maybe half an hour a week. Request it in your plan. And you can say this aligns with NDIA principles. And another question about independent assessments, and then I'll wrap it up there. Someone had asked, are they planning to have independent assessments just for initial access to the NDIS or ongoing for the planning? So many of you will know that the Minister for the NDIS has recently changed from Stuart Robert to Linda Reynolds. Linda Reynolds has heard some of the concerns about independent assessments, and she has put a hold on it for the moment until she evaluates that. Can I just say that we're really lucky in this space to have people like Anne and Jill from Aussie Deaf Kids advocating on your behalf to government. So I'd really encourage you to keep giving them your experiences, because that is passed on. Basically, the plan was in the middle of 2021 to have access through an independent assessment. That's been pushed back. And then they said by the end of 2021, all plan reviews also needed to be done through an independent assessment. So the rollout is that for access and for ongoing reviews, you will need to have independent assessments rather than using a therapist of choice. So any other questions, feel free to email me, and we'll be putting up a few extra links about some of the topics I've talked about today. And if you have any other feedback, I really encourage you to pass it on to myself or to Anne, and we will do our best to communicate that to people who we know are meeting with government officials and trying to make the NDIS the best it possibly can be for children with hearing loss. Thank you.